welcome to the ISP's Tuesday Speaker Series. It is our privilege to welcome Anu Bradford, who is the Henry L. Moses Professor of Law and International Organizations at Columbia Law School. She's written one of the most exciting books of the year called Digital Empire, and we're very lucky that she decided to come and speak with us about it. We're circulating a little flyer for a discount code for anyone that wants to buy the book. I know I'm very eager to read it. Thank you so much and welcome.
Chinmay, thank you so much. And thank you all for joining. Maybe I speak for 20, 25 minutes, and then I'm really eager to hear your questions about the book. Maybe I start with the premise of the book. And it really starts from this acknowledgement that there is increasingly a global consensus that digital economy needs to be regulated. But there is no consensus on what that regulation ought to look like. So in the book, I argue that there are three primary ways to think about digital regulation. And they are captured by the different regulatory models that have been pioneered by the United States and China and the European Union. So I talk about American regulatory model as being a market-driven model. The Chinese model I describe as a state-driven model, and the European model as a rights-driven model. So the American market-driven model is premised on this idea that we want to maximize free speech, free internet, and incentives to innovate. So the government is reserved a very minimalist role, and the governance of technology is in practice handed out to the tech companies themselves. So it is a techno-libertarian, techno-optimist view of the world. The Chinese have a somewhat different view on how technology ought to be governed. So China is very focused on making China a technological superpower, and it is prepared to leverage state resources to meet that goal. But the Chinese government is also deploying technology as a tool for surveillance and censorship and propaganda in an effort to ensure social stability in the country and preserve the political power of the Communist Party. So the Europeans are often, in this public conversation, described as being at the mercy of these two technological superpowers, that they either need to choose between the Chinese world or the American world. And in the book, I argue that the Europeans are not prepared to, nor are they forced to, choose between the Chinese or the American model. For the Europeans, the Chinese model is simply too oppressive, but the American model is too permissive. So the Europeans have chosen their own third way forward, which is what I describe as a rights-driven model. So it really is focusing on a human-centric digital transformation where the preservation of fundamental rights of individuals, democratic structures of the society, but also a more fair notion of distribution of the gains from digital transformation is central. So the Europeans are prepared to shift power away from the large platforms to smaller companies, to individual users, and to the society at large. So then why do I call these three leading technology and regulatory powers empires? So the empire is a word I use rather metaphorically, but I think it is conceptually helpful for us because none of these three regulatory models are confined to the jurisdictions themselves. Instead, each of the three are actively exporting their respective regulatory models and the values underlying those models. But they are exporting it through very different means. So the United States is primarily exporting the private power of its companies. The US tech companies are everywhere. They were set free with the legislation of this country, they're free to grow, and ultimately they felt that they were free to take over the world. And now these companies are really everywhere, and the users around the world are using the services and products by US tech companies. If I just take an example of Meta's Facebook, it has 3 billion users in 160 countries. And through the presence of these companies, they are also embodying these American techno-libertarian views, which are also part of the digital ecosystem that then spreads into the other countries, expanding the American sphere of influence. The Chinese are primarily exporting infrastructure power. So Chinese tech companies are building 5G networks, undersea cables, data centers, smart cities, safe cities, exporting surveillance technologies along the digital Silk Road that reaches across many parts of Asia, Africa, Latin America, and even Europe. So what is the export of the Europeans? How does the European digital empire expand its sphere of influence? So the Europeans are not a technology power the same way China and the US are, but they are a regulatory power, and they are exporting that superpower that they have. So here I'm building on my earlier book that was called The Brussels Effect, How the European Union Rules the World. So the Brussels effect is this idea that the EU is one of the largest and wealthiest consumer markets in the world. It doesn't have the same selling power, but it has the buying power. It is still a destination that is very hard for many multinational companies to avoid. So as the price for accessing the European market, these companies need to follow European regulations, and there's plenty of them. And often these companies believe that it is in their business interest to extend that European regulation across their global conduct or global production because they want to avoid the cost of complying with multiple different regulatory regimes. So by conforming to the most demanding set of regulations, they can often access the entire world. So simply by regulating the single European market, the Europeans are often able to shape the global marketplace because the regulatory compliance by these tech companies extends those regulations across the global marketplace. So if the first argument was that Europe is also an empire, this is not just about China and the US. The second argument is that we are not seeing this kind of splinternet or the idea that the global tech ecosystem would be clearly segmenting into a Chinese sphere of influence, American sphere of influence, and European influence. Because each empire is contributing a different layer to the digital governance. So you have many third markets or non-aligned countries where you see at the same time the presence of US tech companies, Chinese infrastructure, and European regulations. So these tech regimes are colliding in many markets around the world. And that then also leads to a number of battles. And these are the battles that I'm describing in the book. And I think it helps us to think about the battles with two different frameworks. We see horizontal battles and we see vertical battles. So the horizontal battles is really the battles between the US and the EU and the battles between US and China. So one of the major battles that we all focus on is the ongoing tech war between US and China. And that is a battle for technological supremacy, but it's also a battle for economic and geopolitical and, to an extent, ideological state of the world. And then, in addition to this battle, we also see a lot of battles between the US and the EU. Those are regulatory battles. So there's a sense in Europe that American tech companies are coming to Europe and taking too much and giving too little. So the Europeans are now responding to the power that the tech companies are using, which they view as economic power, political power, cultural power, informational power, that then calls for a regulatory response. And the Europeans are now deploying the antitrust laws, their privacy laws, their content moderation laws, soon to be adopted AI Act that is constraining the power of these companies, which then leads the US to say that, no, it's not just our companies overreaching, actually your regulators are overreaching and entering our territory and deprives us from our ability to regulate our companies according to the rules and philosophies that we see fit. So we see those regulatory battles as well. But at the same time, we see these horizontal battles take place. We see each empire fight vertical battles within their jurisdictions. And these are the battles between governments and the tech companies. So each of the governments is also trying to rein in the power of the companies in their jurisdictions. But these two levels of battles are interlinked and they constrain one another. They introduce elements of restraint. So the US is now considering whether it ought to abandon some of its market-driven commitments and actually start regulating tech companies. But any consideration in the Congress for pursuing more antitrust scrutiny, for enacting a federal privacy law, moving on now beyond the executive order and actually having an antitrust law coming out of the US Congress. Those conversations take place in the shadow of the horizontal battle against China. And that prevents the US from forcefully legislating because it fears that is constraining the very asset it has in the battle against China. So that's one reason we are not really seeing the kind of vertical battles that will be fought with the same conviction that we would see the US fight otherwise. So let me now move on to the question that probably interests many of you, which is what happens in these battles. Who prevails in the horizontal battle and who prevails in the vertical battle? So here I make a couple of predictions in the book. So my first prediction is that the American digital empire is declining. The US is losing the ideological battle. There's very little faith in the ability of the market-driven model anymore to respond to the challenges of today's digital economy. So these tech companies have brought a lot of wealth to these companies, but also provided a lot of useful products and services for people around the world. But increasingly, many harms that we are witnessing in societies around the world are also attributed to these companies. And the citizens and governments around the world are increasingly uncomfortable with the tech order that is dominated by these companies. But also the United States itself no longer believes in that self-governance by these tech companies. So if you look at public opinion surveys, Americans want to see more regulation. If you look at how many bills are proposed in the US Congress to try to overturn the existing market-driven model, it is also indicative that the US no longer itself is fully committed to defend that order. It is the deep polarization and largely a dysfunction of the American Congress that has held back the US from actually translating that changing public opinion into concrete new legislative framework. So if we see a decline of the American digital empire, that is in many ways good news for Europe and for China. So there's more space and more demand now for the European rights-driven regulatory model. So increasingly in the democratic world, the governments are aligning behind a variant of the European regulatory model. We see many countries now pursuing regulations that are very similar to what are coming out of the EU. So we all know the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation. There's about 130 countries with that kind of law in place right now, inspired by the GDPR. So this just suggests that there are many governments that are now believing and showing that the European model is the one that they want to replicate. I have potentially three concerns about that world where the European regulatory model does well. So one concern that I often hear is this idea that, look, we probably concede that the Europeans have it right in providing a regulatory model that best checks the power of companies, protects the democratic structures of the society, and then protects the public interest at last. So yes, the individual's fundamental rights are better protected than under the American model, but is that model compatible with innovation? So name a European tech company, and some of you may need a few minutes to come up with one. So is that because they regulate? So there is this perception that Europeans can regulate. They are the regulatory power, but they cannot innovate. And is it because they regulate the digital economy that we don't see those innovations? So one concern is that the European model overdoes it. It is over-regulation, and ultimately it undermines innovation. I am not worried about that. I am very worried about the state of innovation in the European Union, but I don't attribute that concern to digital regulation. It is not because there's a GDPR that we don't see a large European tech company. And it's not that if the Europeans now scrap their plan to enact a binding comprehensive AI Act, it's not that a year from now or 5 years from now, we would see this booming AI unicorns emerging all from Europe. So I'd rather just give you 4 more reasons that I think are much more powerful in explaining why Europe lags behind the United States in tech innovations. One is the absence of an integrated digital single market. It is very hard for tech companies to scale in Europe when they face still largely 27 different sets of regulatory frameworks, different languages, and other elements of fragmentation. Not the case in the US, not the case in China, at least to the same extent. Second is the lack of an integrated, robust capital markets union. it is very hard to fund innovations in Europe. So tech companies do well in the first few rounds, but as soon as they need more funding, as soon as we move to more advanced funding rounds, they basically need to turn to US venture capital, or they are acquired by American tech giants. So the absence of access to the same kind of capital, again, to me, explains much more than the idea that there's a willingness to protect the fundamental right to privacy. Third is punitive bankruptcy laws and attitudes towards risk-taking. So risk-taking is not encouraged in Europe, and there are bankruptcy laws that actually make your failure fatal. You cannot raise money. You cannot have a second chance. The same way that in the US, the model is kind of built into this idea of the US venture capital is that failure is not fatal. It's a rite of passage. You try, you fail, and then you raise money again. And that really sets up a different kind of innovative culture where there's many tech entrepreneurs who are prepared to drive off the cliff, and some of them really fall off the cliff. But when you have enough people trying to do that, it sometimes works, and we see the result. A fourth reason that to me is very important is the role of immigration and the diversity of talent that wants to do the innovations in the US. Here again, the Europeans are way behind the US. So if you look at the role of immigration in fueling the American innovations, it's a very powerful story. Over 50% of over $1 billion startups in the US have an immigrant founder. And if for a moment we just focus on the big household names, the large platforms and their founders, Steve Jobs of Apple is a son of a Syrian immigrant. Jeff Bezos of Amazon is a second-generation Cuban immigrant. Elon Musk of Tesla is South African. Sergey Brin, the co-founder of Google, is Russian. Eduardo Saverin, the co-founder of Facebook, is Brazilian. And I could go on. That, to me, is a really big reason why the Americans are doing so well. You cannot innovate if you don't have the innovators, and why confine yourself to the domestic talent pool? So again, this is something that I would rather see the Europeans to do. But why it's relevant for our argument, if the US were to move towards a European rights-driven model, that would not dismantle the American capital markets. That would not rewrite the country's bankruptcy laws. That would not prevent the immigrants from finding their way, often through US universities, to the US labor market. So my concern with the European model is that it will somehow inherently be inconsistent with innovation. I'm much more worried about something else, which is the Europeans underdoing it rather than overdoing it. I think the Europeans are often failing in enforcing their regulatory model. They are winning the ideological battle, increasingly convincing the world that they were right with articulating their rights-driven vision. But what we don't see enough is the Europeans successfully entrenching that vision into actually affecting the market outcomes. There's been 10 billion in fines against Google across 4 different antitrust cases. Google's market share has barely budged in the EU. We also see continuing violations of data privacy despite the GDPR having been enforced for a long time. So my concern is really the implementation and enforcement of that regulatory architecture that then still leaves to be proven that the European regulatory model also prevails in practice. Because if it doesn't, then it is the American market-driven model that prevails, even if people are actively turning away from that. A third concern for the Europeans is that, yes, the regulatory model is gaining a lot of traction in the democratic world, but not much in the authoritarian and authoritarian-leaning world. There's a big part of the world that is much more drawn to the Chinese state-driven model. And there are a couple of reasons for that. So let me mention just 2. So one reason is that China is providing these digital infrastructures that are vital to many societies. There are many countries that need a path to digital development, and China is providing them one. Chinese infrastructure is pretty good, and it's affordable. And there are many countries where they say that, look, this is what we need. This is what we care about. And I don't wake up first thing in the morning thinking about my data privacy. I can't afford to think about my data privacy. I'm actually okay with some degree of survival because my physical safety is more important for me than the luxury concern of privacy that the Europeans can afford to think about, maybe Americans can afford to think about. So there are many societies that say that, look, we need to be pragmatic. of what we need for our development and what we can afford. And there's for us one player in town. And a second, which I think makes it very hard for the US and the EU to persuade the countries that they should turn away from the Chinese model, is this idea that China has shown to the world that freedom is not necessary for innovation. It was a paragraph to write in the book that I was very uncomfortable writing, because I like to think as a proponent of liberal democracy that all good things flow from freedom. But I think we need to concede that the Chinese digital economy and ability to produce leading companies is impressive without China embracing a model of political freedom. So there might now be a footnote to this story. Chinese companies are lagging behind the US companies in generative AI. There's some question whether you can do as well in generative AI if you need to make sure that the data that you are feeding into those large language models is consistent with the censorship regime and conforms to the message of the Communist Party. And right now, it seems to be that Americans have an easier time making that case. But there's still a whole lot of innovations that people around the world see and associate with the Chinese model. And they say that, look, we like political control, we like innovation and economic growth. We look at China, and they can have both. So I think there is a real battle then for the future of digital economy in terms of what it does to liberal democracy. And that is the most important battle that I focus on. So what happens to liberal democracy? I want to remind that battle can be lost in one of two ways. So one is if the US and EU lose the horizontal battle to China, and the world is turning increasingly to digital authoritarianism. That is not a victory for liberal democracy. But liberal democracy is also eroded if the US and EU lose a vertical battle to tech companies. That is also not good for liberal democracy. And here my concern is that the United States is not capable of properly regulating. The legislation that is coming out of Congress is very minimal, if at all. China doesn't have a hard time legislating. The Europeans can legislate, but the Europeans have a hard time enforcing. China doesn't really have a hard time enforcing. When the Communist Party decides it's time to crack down on big tech, the Communist Party cracks down on big tech. So if that is the case, we are forced to concede that digital economy is either governed by authoritarians, whereas democratic governments are prone to fail in that same endeavor, or the digital economy is governed by tech companies. And then we actually would concede that the true digital empires are either authoritarians or the tech companies. And that would be a really uncomfortable conclusion for anybody who believes in liberal democracy as a foundation of digital economy and human engagement. So let me maybe leave it there, and I will take your questions. Wonderful. Who wants to get us started?
Yes.
Yes, Mr.
Thank you. This was very thought-provoking. Anything out with really nice way. Thank you. It will be very helpful to think with. My question is why the global axis is authoritarianism versus democracy.
Yeah.
That is a question we get a lot, rather than say like the former colonial powers and the formerly colonized world, or what you might call the majority world.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like why choose authoritarianism versus democracy over the alternative, which seems to me to provide a sort of more historical account of why developing countries are in the place where they need to need to like develop and can't be worried about privacy.
Yeah.
Even like if that is the case.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I don't think it necessarily is an exclusive way to frame various alliances that we are observing. And I think it depends on the various issue, we can see other kinds of alliances. And I'm also not saying that it's necessarily helpful description. So it can be very alienating. First of all, it's very hard to think about democracy as a binary concept. There are many countries that fall somewhere in between. And by insisting on this idea that you are with us or against us, that you are real democracy, you risk pushing a lot of countries to the Chinese sphere of influence. President Biden has made democracy a very central tenet of his foreign policy. And there's been a lot of effort also to harness a coalition of techno-democracies in an effort to provide, sort of consolidate the democratic front and provide an alternative to China. And I see where that is coming from, because ideologically, there's not that much of a difference between the US and the EU, especially now that the US is moving closer to the EU in recognizing the importance of the rights. The EU is also now moving closer to the US, initially being much less willing to make this about anti-China. The US has had a much tougher approach towards China. The Europeans are hardening approach, and I attribute most of that to China's refusal to condemn Russian invasion of Ukraine. That is politically, for the Europeans, extremely important. And that has then shifted the Europeans to actually align closer to the US in terms of sanctions and other sort of restrictive policies. So in that sense, there is just observing a greater political alignment that rests on an ideological foundation. And I think it is still the battle cry around which you can sort of rally the cooperation in transatlantic circles, but also then to convince Australians and Canadians and New Zealanders and South Koreans and Japanese to say that, look, we still share a vision of a democratic, free, digital society. And despite our differences, that ideological foundation allows us to collaborate and sort of move towards the kind of standards that all of us can ultimately live with. But as I said initially, I don't think it's necessarily always helpful framing. It can be an alienating framing. It can be a sort of conflict escalating framing to really make it ideological, as opposed to sort of think about how can we think about this in pragmatic terms to find pockets of cooperation where we all still can work together. And the big question was now, there's this big, the UK AI summit that the UK is hosting this week. One big question was whether to invite China. And everybody wasn't first comfortable, because the idea was that if we only have like-minded countries participating, there's more of a chance to go deeper in cooperation. But also, if you leave China out, you leave a massive part of AI development out. And the idea that there wouldn't even be conversations with China on issues like AI, which does not respect the boundaries of democracy and autocracy, but it really is a global issue. I don't think that's necessarily advised, but I do think that there are certain shared concerns that the US and the EU share when it comes to the way, for instance, how China is using AI. So if you look at the EU's AI Act, then the particular AI applications that the EU altogether plans to prohibit, they are almost like directly lifted from some of the practices that are very prevalent in China around facial recognition in public places and so forth. Yes, please.
Thank you so much. That was really thought-provoking. I want to press a little bit on the idea of three empires. Why don't you develop a little more why I shouldn't be pessimistic that this is just one empire. And it's an empire of digital authoritarianism. There's two legs. One is driven by capitalism.
Yeah.
The other one is driven by political authority.
Yeah.
China, because I think what we are facing is the concentration of capital and concentration of power somehow overlap.
Yeah.
Through regulations, you yourself said the American companies are only obliging by so long as they get one market share, and ultimately these profiteers then sort of companies will want more power.
Yeah.
We want more concentration of political power because that means more money.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So the dystopian future that I want to escape is one where these companies no longer necessarily abide by our shared value of the democracy. And so you have two forms of, like pure evil. We either have Facebook's authority regime or WeChat.
Yeah.
But so just like wanted to invite you to say a little more
Yeah. No, I think it's very interesting to think about sort of this sort of capitalist pursuit and set of values that these companies represent as a form of authoritarianism. And there are many who would say that, look, I am no more comfortable with Elon Musk running this world than I am with President Xi. So it's another kind of type of absolute power that is very divorced from sort of democratic society and inclusive society. So in that sense, the book is very uncomfortable with that excessive concentration of corporate power, but it's also very realistic in how hard that power is to peel back and rein in once it's become so entrenched. And I'm particularly worried right now with AI. It's the same front runners that are now also leading in the AI race. And the more time they have before guardrails set in, the more they can even entrench their already extensive dominance. So I think I share your concern. There are ways that I would ask the question, though, that is all sort of variant of authoritarianism now, sort of using your labeling, equally harmful, and are all of us equally uncomfortable with all of that? And one question I was thinking about it then when there was the congressional hearings, the questionings of the CEO of TikTok. And Americans were obsessed with the idea of Chinese surveillance. And I had that conversation then with one of the architects of European privacy regulation from the European Commission. And I asked, is this the same conversation in Brussels? And he said, no, we equally uncomfortable being surveilled by Beijing or Washington or by our own governments. And we are equally uncomfortable being surveilled by sort of private companies, the surveillance capitalism and the exploitation of our data by these companies, as we are by surveillance of governments. So one question that I would ask for each of you to think about is that, are you indifferent if private companies have your data or if governments, so NSA or Facebook having your data? And then if basically PLA, the Chinese Communist Party, has your data, or Washington NSA has your data? And is that all equal to you? But I think ideally, if you really are truly taking as your goal a democratic digital society, you are right to conclude that I think neither of those dimensions or legs of authoritarianism of the power, and I'm using your way to describe now authoritarianism, is consistent with democracy. And in many ways, I think the book is not giving up on this idea that the governments can, even democratic governments can govern technology. I don't believe that tech companies can decouple themselves from governments. I don't believe they can force their way into mergers. They cannot say they don't pay digital taxes that they owe. But we just need to have much more political courage, including in this country, to assert the regulatory power. So the architects of those who wrote Section 230, they retained the power to rewrite that law, to repeal that law, and pass additional laws. The question is, will they use that power? It's not that they don't have the authority. For the Europeans too, I think it needs a really renewed commitment to actually deploy the power that they have so that they can have their seat at the table, and not only just the seat, but really kind of make sure that they have the veto power on how these companies ultimately behave. But yes, I am not comfortable with the world in which we are governed by these companies, even if I don't think they are all in the mission to destroy democracy. But they don't wake up in the morning thinking about what can I do to democracy and public interest today. Yes, please.
Thank you so much. Super interesting. So my question is, like, to what extent does this model, to what extent is it specific to the tech industry? And not just sort of a description of, the broader political economies of the United States, Europe, and China? Because in a way, one thing you could sort of draw out of this is that the European model you're talking about is, a sort of novel tech-centered regulatory regime that is sort of doing something above and beyond basic other kinds of economic regulation and the pursuit of geopolitics. So just curious if this does apply to other industries, and whether there is something particular about tech here.
Yeah. So I think yes and no. Yes, in the sense that these are the values that are not tech-specific values. I think Americans have traditionally been uncomfortable with government involvement in other regulatory spaces, whether we talk about environmental regulation and sort of some aspects of consumer protection. So there are many domains within which the European more kind of precautionary approach and comfort with the government created trust in government improving outcomes by intervening also then plays out. And the same thing with, if you think about the the Chinese state-driven model is that it's not only confined to this tech sector. In many ways, though, the stakes are particularly high, and the questions of how those models work within tech can be sometimes more complicated and take us to these very intricate questions. So if you think about how in the tech space you sort of compare these different regimes, the US and the EU both share their commitment to democracy. I think both would say that our model is seeking to maximize democracy. But that then leaves in the tech space, when you examine sort of how they try to realize that value, often to different regulatory outcomes. So it leads, for instance, in content moderation, the US to defend that some content needs to stay up in the name of democracy, and for the Europeans to say that needs to come down in the name of democracy. So I think sometimes when you apply these models into tech, you see some differences that really allows you to see how they approach, what is their sort of faith in technology assisting in generating certain outcomes. And also then it's just like the volume of activity that happens, so it's mediated through the tech platforms, just I think accentuates the salience of many of these issues in the way that I think these battles are particularly important. I do want to say, though, that the book, I tried very hard, and I'm very proud that I tried to be much more nuanced to also show that when I describe each model, none of them are pure. State doesn't always win in China. The Americans don't believe that markets can be a solution to everything. And the Europeans also, it's also a very neoliberal project in many ways. It's all about integrating the market. There are many state-driven characteristics as well. So I think really the idea is that I don't want to be fixated on the labels. I think it helps us to really explain sort of when there are fundamental trade-offs, like where do the countries ultimately, where their defaults are, and they lean more heavily into those instincts. But ultimately, I think tech is a particularly interesting space to discover sort of the extent and the sort of scope of those values and how much explanatory power they have. Yes, Jimmy.
That was fascinating. You said the word that I've been thinking about all through your lecture, which is neoliberal.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering whether you could say a little more about the permeation of the neoliberal ideology and how that's affected the degree to which the companies steer law.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd like to push a little more on the European question that you raised, which is that the Europeans have successfully put forward the argument that tech should be regulated.
Yeah.
But what's interesting to me is that the companies are pushing back in the name of freedom, which appears to be sort of this neoliberal idea of freedom.
Yeah.
And I'm very curious about where your book kind of landed with this idea that the company should always have a seat at the table.
Yeah.
Whether it's with the Biden government, the UN.
Yeah.
I think possibly low-key even with China.
Yes. So where the companies or the governments would need to have a seat.
The companies.
Yeah.
I'm shocked at the degree to which companies have a say
Yeah.
in rulemaking.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So the neoliberalism, I think it's actually, if you think about technology as just an extremely important component of growth strategies of these economies, all three economies, there's been some neoliberal convictions under the assumption that you need to set these companies relatively free and trust the market so that we can capture the growth potential of these companies. So I talk about some neoliberal commitments of China, that the growth of the Chinese tech companies cannot just be traced to subsidies by Beijing. A lot of that has been fueled by venture capital, including American venture capital. So there's been a lot of, I think, sort of neoliberal thinking that has been even guiding the growth of the Chinese tech industry. The same thing, like I mentioned briefly, Europe, is that all digital regulation in Europe generally serve two purposes. There's one, that GDPR, it seeks to advance the fundamental right to privacy, but it also seeks to harmonize the regulation across the 27 member states. So it seeks to facilitate trade, like every other law. So there's kind of which is I think why also explains why Europeans are so good at regulating, is that there's a political economy story there. You get the right, you get the market-driven people because yes, we are integrated the European market. We are creating more opportunities for trade and economic growth. And then you get more of a civil society and advocates and others who said, yes, but with this regulation, we are also enhancing consumer rights. We are enhancing the fundamental right to privacy. So there's kind of the marriage of a neoliberal, pro-integration, pro-single market, pro-trade narrative that is combined then with the broader kind of consumer welfare, sustainability, all other goals that are driving the Europeans. But in that sense, I think there's a lot of neoliberalism under each tech regimes. And the tech companies are exploiting that narrative all the time. Sometimes they say about political freedom, sometimes they talk about economic freedom, because ultimately they portray themselves as engines of growth in the service of what society needs. And so I think this is the kind of conversation that where freedom is often used to contrast to sort of what would be in the absence of the greater choice that they are bringing through their products and through services, and ultimately how they are making a contribution to discourse. And even though I think that's the part that they have a hardest time of defending. The same thing that if you think about the neoliberal argument about free market, there's many who say that the US market is not free these days. It's nothing. This is not the idea of free market. It's a very concentrated market, which is not competitive, and where only few are able to compete. So I think there's a real sort of interesting conversation about like what does the free market look like, and what does the kind of free speech look like, what the boundaries are. But the tech companies certainly use that sort of default back to that narrative, and especially right now in the sort of heightening US-China tech war, there's this idea that without us, you don't have the growth, and without growth, the US is not able to compete against China. Then you asked a little bit more about this idea of the tech companies having a seat at the table. I think there are tables and there are tables. And I think there are tables where they should have a seat, because it's very hard to regulate technology if you don't fully understand how those regulations can be implemented. And there, I think it can be very helpful to talk to tech companies. I really think that the regulators who think that they regulate without actually discussing all the market participants have a hard time writing good regulations. My problem is when that conversation would only focus on tech companies and not get the feedback from the civil society, from users of technology, from the other players that are critical in the digital society. And there in the US in particular, the research shows that the lobbying is much more one-sided. Those with the more resources have much greater access to political process. Lobbying takes place in Europe as well, but the lobbying by tech companies is partially offset, and it's supplemented by relatively greater access by civil society to decision makers as well. And if you look at the really powerful digital regulations that came out of Brussels recently, so the GDPR, Digital Markets Act, Digital Services Act, those were heavily lobbied, yet ultimately were not watered down, which really shows that the tech companies have less ability. I'm not saying they have no ability to shape legislation, but they are more constrained in their ability to influence outcomes. The same thing with this idea of AI. The idea is that, yes, we had a rather sweeping executive order yesterday, but ultimately many of those commitments are still voluntary and rely on the companies willing to obey them. Guidelines, best practices. We also have these voluntary commitments that have been extracted from tech companies. To me, that's the regulatory model that still has the tech companies making the calls. Whereas the European model is that we need to have binding obligations grounded in rule of law and subjected to democratic oversight, which is really then sort of elevating the role of the governments and conceding that there are certain tables where the tech companies ought not to be sitting. Very good. Yes, please.
Yeah, thanks for your talk. I wanted to ask about what we mean when we speak about one or other of these regulatory models prevailing or being defeated.
Yeah.
Do you mean like in a decisive sense? We think that there's this other possibility where the battles themselves are sustainable.
Yeah.
Is that possible? Would that be preferable?
Yeah. So I think there's a question whether any of them ultimately will fully prevail. What I mean by prevailing is probably that they ultimately have greatest influence. They have greatest uptake. So we see the world's regulatory regimes across the governments converging into one of the three models. So in that sense, that they are the ones that become the primary way of governing digital economy. But I also talk in the book how many of these battles will continue to go on. There's not the finite resolution to many of these battles. Instead, we're going to see sort of the mix of escalation and de-escalation in the tech war. We see pressures towards greater rivalry, but we also see pressures toward restraint. And I think one of the biggest tensions in digital economy right now is that we are seeing much of the digital economy increasingly through a national security lens, which means that even the US is increasingly playing Beijing's game. We are very far from the market-driven model right now. It's export controls, it's investment restrictions, inbound, outbound, massive state subsidies in the economy. If you listen to the conversation about banning TikTok in the US, this is not about sort of free speech and the principles of the market-driven model. And my fear is that I understand where that national security lens is coming from, but even the Europeans are also now sort of in practice, some of them endorsing much more industrial policy-driven tech policy, which may mean if you take the Brussels effect seriously, Europe can become a major exporter of techno-protectionism because the Brussels effect exports good and bad regulations alike. And if the Europeans are converting antitrust into industrial policy, pursuing data localization in practice, that's what we are seeing. So in that sense, I think in terms of the US and the EU are now shifting the world to some extent towards that national security driven, much more techno-nativist lens, which is playing to the strengths of China. And what my fear is that they sometimes forget what has served their societies well, why the European model is doing well, is because of that it's perceived genuine commitment to rights. Why the US model has been good is that ultimately it has thrived as a free society and a society that has welcomed foreign investments and that has been sort of committed to economic openness. So those are some of the issues that I don't think we can see one of the models prevailing. I see a dynamic shift whereby we are rejecting the philosophy. So that philosophy, I think, is no longer the one that many people, individuals would rally around or governments would rally around. But then the question is, since the Europeans struggling with enforcement, it's not going to be a complete victory. I think much of that digital economy, wherever the governance fails, is still going to be reflecting the market-driven model. So in that sense, again, it's an attempt to tell actually a rather nuanced story, which hopefully does justice to the more nuanced question as well. Yes, please.
Interested in your thoughts on the form that innovation might take in Europe, given the kind of regulation. I was thinking of, for example, Nextcloud development in Germany and the adoption of it by large academic institutions, or the development of Proton Mail and a suite of services in Switzerland, where there's a kind of advantage in the service, design of the service, form of innovation that is tied to the jurisdiction, or the regulatory regime, or the approach to privacy.
Yeah.
And so maybe this is about the purity you were mentioning and the distinctions that it's not innovation only in America and regulation.
Yeah.
This is sort of a European style innovation that is not so much on the model of centralized platform development, but maybe in a different direction. And in a similar vein, you might think of things like the Chips and Science Act.
Yeah.
America as a kind of response to Chinese infrastructure and development.
Yeah.
And so there again, kind of impurities. So I wonder if
Yeah. So very good. So I think for the Europeans, how they approach this conversation is this idea that all regulation is not good, but neither is all innovation. So the question, if Europeans are so uncomfortable with the surveillance capitalism of these big platforms, why would they try to replicate them? Why would you want to have a European Google? Unless you can say that we are going to develop a more sort of public interest focused version of it, more privacy protecting a variant of these platforms. But ultimately, you also need to think about what are your strengths. So the Europeans have a lot of, they still build on a tremendous sort of very good research and industrial sort of manufacturing. And that's why Europeans are, for instance, still leading in robots. That's one of the domain of AI where the Europeans are doing really well. Maybe they should be exactly building on those companies. And the idea is that if you don't want to have that large sort of tech giants, maybe you really think about what is the kind of ecosystem that is consisting of smaller but very innovative players. But what is the kind of governance system that then allows those companies to thrive? So I think in the idea that if you're only sort of innovating in response to the current geopolitical reality, that's partially what we're seeing in China. The government is more willing to sort of top down say that, look, we don't want to see all of you just shop online and have these, mind-numbing conversations online. We rather want to have the ingenuity to be channeled to hard tech, to real tech, to deep tech. We want to see semiconductors. We see those ideas that really make China great and that retains the sort of technological sovereignty and reduces the dependencies of the country. But even if you made the declaration on issues like semiconductors, I don't think any of these three can declare technological sovereignty when it comes to semiconductors. It's too complex, it's too expensive, it's too integrated globally. And even the Europeans are now spending over 40 billion to try to become no longer 90%, but 80% dependent on semiconductors. It is a really expensive path to travel. So in that sense, the kind of a very industrial policy, directive innovation policy, trying to sort of predict or sort of prioritize the direction of tech, I think it can be only so effective, and it's very expensive. So I think you're asking exactly the right question, and I don't think the answer is that the Europeans should try to replicate what the Chinese and Americans are necessarily doing. Yes.
If we stay on that, first of all, amazing talk. This made me think so much, and I will be buying the book.
Thank you.
So if we stay within that ideological plane of the three models, I was wondering that there seems to be another model that pops up, especially within the marginalized community, which is a community.
Yeah.
And rights. The European rights is not the same as the community rights.
Yeah.
And so I was wondering, even within the US, right, there's indigenous rights that focus on community.
Yeah.
But that's not what we think when we think of the US model. It's
Yeah.
a market model. That had its own politics of domination, like dominant groups and power. So within the three that you were, and I know that community is big in lots of African countries, it's big in Islamic countries.
Yeah.
South Asia, Bangladesh is very big on thinking about community when we think about regulation. So is that like, are we, when we think about the three big that you mentioned, is it related to power? And there are all these other models that are out there, especially the one on community.
Yeah.
That didn't fit maybe with this, or well, or was this something you were thinking about and we're trying to think, is there a big nation that does this? If not, it doesn't.
Yeah. Yeah.
I was wondering if you could talk.
Yeah. So very good. I mean, I think there's a broader question of whether the rest of the world, the non-aligned countries, are at the mercy of empires. So whether they can basically selectively adopt elements of empires or reject some of these empires. I think there are countries like India that is in a position, it has tech sector, it has still governance capability, and it has some ability to more strategically to follow and reject with its engagement of some aspects of these empires. But then there are many countries where I think they are more dependent on foreign technologies. They cannot build their own infrastructure. And this was my earlier comments about dependence on Chinese infrastructure as the one that they can afford. So there are some instances where they are still sort of dependent on the empires providing them a sort of the backbone for the digital development. The same way with the European rights-driven model is that there are many countries who willingly free ride on the European model. They say this is not regulatory imperialism. We are actually quite willing to do that. The same thing that it's not that China is imposing its infrastructure. There's a lot of, in many cases, there's also very genuine demand for that infrastructure. But I think the question would be whether many of the communities, like the ones that you say, can selectively use the philosophy of the rights-driven model, maybe even if they are not in a position to sort of rewrite the entire regulatory architecture, take elements, some language of rights, but then expand what is their notion of rights, who gets those rights, who should be, if you still agree that the power should not only vest in the hands of the big tech companies, who should it be redistributed to? Which are the communities or individuals that ought to benefit from that? And that would be kind of more taking more agency with only emulating the EU selectively and making sure that the kind of rights that are important for Europeans may not be the very rights that ought to take precedence in conversations in different societies. So I think that ultimately is probably leading to a more sustainable governance model, because in societies and communities where sort of the blanket copying of the European variant of rights that are reflective of European values is not necessarily what enhances these countries' welfare the best.
About that today, but this has been a fascinating talk. and a wonderful discussion. Thank you so much for engaging with us. I hope that you'll come back. We're all very eager, but it's been really good.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for having me. Thanks for great questions. Thank you.